Remember how Doga said he's not invincible because of his armor, but he's invincible because he's Doga? Yeah, Duessel's like that too. Fire Emblem unit identity is often closely tied to the class that they're in, especially if that identity is somewhat unique. I talked about this with FE7's Jafar in a previous video and how he makes Assassin look like a good class even though it really isn't, and I think Duessel has a similar thing going on. If you're ever worried about the balancing of any kind of Fire Emblem fan game you're making, put your conscience to rest by looking at Duessel's bases in Ephraim route. This man joins at level 8 promoted, a level that a lot of units might not even make it to until late game, unless you grind them in the arena or between chapters. And more importantly, he has the stats to show for it. His most standout feature is his bulk. 41 HP and 17 defense is outrageous. Enemies with 17 or less attack, which probably exists in FE8 hard mode, deal 0 damage to Duessel. But I honestly think that is less embarrassing than doing 1 damage, because at that point you're doing a 41 hit KO. That's a brand new sentence right there. Units exist that eventually attain more physical durability than Duessel, but they usually require some level of effort to train, whereas Duessel just joins like this. Another 17 plus stat that Duessel has is Strength, which is also 17, but hey, it's pretty good. It doesn't feel as unfair in a vacuum as at 17 defense, probably because it doesn't make a tink sound. But then you combine it with its weapon ranks: A swords, A lances, A axes. I think this was the developer's way of showing just how good Ephraim's instructor was at using weapons, but it's so overkill. The game is telling you that Duessel is better at using swords than Garrick, Marissa, and Joshua, better at using lances than Vanessa and Gilliam, and better at using axes than Garcia and Dosla. He is experienced. Duessel can use almost any weapon in the game as long as it's not a bow. He doesn't need most of them, but he can pick and choose the best one for any battle you want him up against. So Duessel has high durability, high power, and great versatility, but he does have some minor flaws. His speed is only 12, which is fine, but it's not especially fast. It's enough to double a large portion of FE8's mostly weak enemies, but if anything outspeeds him, it probably doesn't have enough attack to really hurt him anyway, so it's okay if he takes a bit longer to kill it. Speaking of taking longer, Duessel's mobility is also not outstanding. He's got 6 movement, which is the standard for promoted infantry units, but Duessel is not infantry, he's got a horse, so he takes terrain penalties just like paladins do. For example, forests cost 2 movement for infantry units to move through, while they cost 3 for mounted units. So infantry units and paladins both lose about a third of their total movement to a forest, but Duessel gives up half of his total just to hide in some trees. If you have to move through multiple forests, or god forbid through a desert, Duessel's mobility slows down to an absolute crawl. What I just described, what Duessel is supposed to embody, is the exact trade-off Great Knight is supposed to be. You sacrifice mobility for versatility. Paladins get 2 more movement, but Great Knights have more durability, more power, and an extra weapon type to choose from. Sacred Stones was the debut of the Great Knight class as we know it today. After FE6 and 7 gave Paladins 8 move and 3 different weapon types, in FE8 the Cavalier promotion was split in 2, and now you have a meaningful choice. Either you get more choice in weapons and increased sturdiness, or you'll be able to move further. Paladins are more mobile, so they get to enemies and objectives faster, but Great Knights have more defense and more weapon options once they reach. It'll just be a little bit later. This division and characterization is consistent in games after the GBA series, like Awakening, Fates, and Engage. This split makes sense if we just look at Duessel in a vacuum. If a good Great Knight is supposed to be a bulky, strong unit, a hybrid between a Cavalier and an Armor Knight, then Duessel makes a great Knight. But I think this falls apart in the context of FE8, because Duessel is not invincible because he's a Great Knight, Duessel is invincible because he is Duessel. First counterexample, Seth. Seth is the perfect unit, a contender for best unit in this series, for many reasons. He's around all game long, he's got more movement than almost anyone, he kills everything with 1-2 range, and crucially, he doesn't die. While Seth has base HP and defense that are not as high as Duessel's, he has the entire early game to grow a couple levels with those insane growths of his. And once Duessel does join the party, Seth's bulk is still not going to exactly match Duessel's, but it's going to be good enough to survive almost any enemy group you throw him to. Duessel's bulk is mostly overkill, and by all standards, Seth is still a tank. Alright, so maybe Seth is just an exception. Seth is invincible because he is Seth. But what about the other Paladins and Great Knights in the game? What about the unpromoted Cavaliers, Franz, Kyle, and that other guy? Do they manage to communicate this choice between higher mobility versus better combat in their split promotions? Let's look at that. Paladin gives them +1 move upon promotion, while Great Knight gives them -1. They go from 7 to 6. But in exchange, the Great Knight gives axes and presumably better strength and defense. So, right now, from the top of your head, how much more strength and defense do you think a Great Knight promotion gives? How much is that heavier armor protecting them? Go ahead, type your answer for a comment right now. Now, before I wrote my script for this, I thought the answer would be 2 or 3 points each. Maybe 2 or 3 in one at least. Or maybe 1 point in each. This is the promotion bonuses for each class. They give the same defense, but Great Knight gives 1 more HP and 1 more strength. And that's it. Great Knight also, strangely enough, gives an extra point of speed, which makes it better in that department, but it doesn't really rhyme with the slower, bulkier type of aesthetic that they're going for. Now don't get me wrong, I don't mind the point of speed, it makes sense from a game balance perspective, I just think it's weird. A Great Knight also gets more constitution, which makes them a bit faster when using heavier weapons, but the best lances that you'd want to use already weigh less than the constitution they would have as paladins, so it doesn't really enable Great Knights to use weapons that Paladins would get weighed down by. I think it's mostly there so they don't get weighed down by the axes. And they get an extra point of HP, I guess, and Paladin gets +30 sword rank. Okay, cool. So technically, I would say Great Knight gives better combat, but only slightly. A couple of points here and there, but it doesn't make as big of a difference as the class suggests. The unpromoted Cavaliers don't really become Duessel by promoting to Great Knight. In fact, the bulkiest of the trio, Kyle, only reaches Duessel's base defense, I kid you not, as a level 2010 Great Knight. Franz doesn't reach his defense until he's 2017, and Ford never reaches it, because he's benched. The reason the Cavalier trio can't compare to Duessel is simply because their base stats and growth rates get in the way, and the promotion bonus doesn't do enough to fix it. For example, Ford has a base of 8 and a 20% defense growth. His defense is never going to be anything above mediocre. A 21 Ford as a Great Knight only has about 13 defense, which is okay, but I wouldn't describe him as a tank, and it's the same if he goes Paladin. I think if you were to put the effort into raising a unit like this to 21 and promote them to a class that sacrifices his mobility, he should at least get like +5 defense for his troubles. Similarly, his strength is going to be somewhere between 13 and 15 no matter which path he goes. It's serviceable for flunky duty, but it's really nothing special, especially for a unit that you have to put effort into. It's very clear that your promotion choice is not what determines how strong, fast, or bulky a unit is, it's which unit you are. Ford, Kyle, and Franz's stats are going to be roughly the same regardless of whether they go Paladin or Great Knight. And unless you go out of your way to train them to a really high level in the tower or the arena, or you give them lots of stat boosters, they're not going to be as bulky as Duessel is at base until the very end of the game, if that. And yes, I am comparing a level 8 Great Knight Duessel to a level 1 Great Knight Cavalier trio. That might seem unfair to the Cavaliers, but there's no reason to not compare them just because there's a level gap. It wasn't my decision to put a level 8 Great Knight at this point in the game, and I'm not going to hold off on comparing them until they've caught up to Duessel's base level. They are at these levels during the same chapters, fighting the same enemies, and their performance can be measured. As far as I'm aware, the game is not stopping you from using Duessel until everyone else is caught up in level, and you would shoot yourself in the foot if you did. Tangent aside, if I were to redesign their promotion bonuses, I think Great Knight should have had higher HP, strength, and defense. I personally prefer to go Paladin with the Cavaliers in the game as is, just because I think the extra movement makes a much bigger difference. If I'm using them as full-time combat units, like I usually do with Franz, then I find the full move gets into combat significantly faster. The biggest reason to go Great Knight is being able to use axes, and they're nice, but if I haven't benched Franz by the time I get a Night Crest, then his level ups have been good enough to keep up without the use of those. And the same goes for Kyle if he turns out well, and I guess if you have a hacked game cartridge, the same could go for Ford. Usually, I have at least one Cavalier that is doing more rescue dropping than combat, which once again means the extra move trumps over the slightly better combat for me. And keeping in mind, the better combat really just means they can use axes. It's really the main difference maker for promotion choices in FE8. Extra weapon types and mobility are just much more noticeable and more impactful than small differences in stats that they gain on promotion. And this is the case for a lot of other promotion choices in FE8. I think the promotion bonus had the potential to make units a lot more distinct, but because they only vary by a couple of points each, they don't. Now, to play devil's advocate for a minute, I actually quite like it when individual units are unique. There are games where unit identity is kind of taken away by reclassing options, such as Shadows of Valentia and Three Houses. I imagine it's quite difficult to make a game where there's both a meaningful difference between units in the same class and meaningful differences between classes, especially in a game where a single unit can be multiple different classes. But I think Sacred Stones is too far in the opposite direction, where the promotion choice doesn't really end up changing units substantially, even though the vibes given off by the game try to convince you otherwise. And they do try. This is the in-game description of the Great Knight class: knights with great mobility and defense. I can forgive the mobility bit because they do have Canto, but that defense does not describe any Great Knight in this game except for Duessel. This perception has even bled through to the Fire Emblem fandom. Check the Fire Emblem wiki for example. Great Knights are built to be bulkier and more defensively oriented than the Paladin by possessing greater HP and defense, and slightly superior strength at the expense of lower skill and speed, though this is more pronounced in the Sacred Stones / Awakening version of the class. And I'm just thinking, what do you mean more pronounced? Do you mean the part where Great Knight has 1 point of strength over Paladin? Or do you mean the part where Great Knight has more speed than a Paladin? And this is the good wiki. Now I will say that as far as Duessel goes, what they're saying about the class is true, and Duessel is a member of the class. He is at least partially representative. So it's not entirely wrong when talking about what units in that class are like, but it is completely unhelpful when trying to decide on what to promote your cavalier into. I will say that Awakening does do a better job at this. If we look at Sully here for example, you can see that the differences between a Great Knight and a Paladin promotion are more distinct, and more fitting to the class's categorizations. Great Knight has 1 more HP, 2 more strength, and most importantly, 4 more defense, while Paladin has 3 more speed and even 5 more resistance. These differences are also highlighted in the para bonuses of each class as well, so it appears that Intelligent Systems also agreed that the Great Knight and Paladin needed to have a stat profile that reflected their characteristics more. I also like how they added a new class for Seth-like units that just destroys everything.